So it's a great honor for me to open the final session. Our speaker today is Ulana Kirchev. She's an PhD student at the Catholic University. This is the example where our connection to France is quite natural. The protagonist of her presentation is Piotr Rawicz, who has Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish, French narratives very naturally. I won't speak too much. I will give the floor to Ulana, who will say it a lot better. Ulana, the floor is yours. Thank you. I hope you can all hear me.
Супер, дякую. Моя тема не про такі намацальні речі, як
subject is not about something as tangible as we were talking about previously, but I hope this won't make it less clear. So initially I would like to say a few words about who Piotr Rawicz is. He's not some super famous figure even in academic circles. He is a French francophone writer who was born in 1919 in Lviv in a Jewish accultured assimilated family. They were a Polish-speaking family, non-religious, essentially. And this is reflected in their names because his name is Piotr Henryk. But this family kept the memory of traditions, and Piotr was even hired a teacher who was teaching him reading and writing in Hebrew. The Rawicz family were friends with the Rudnitsky family, it so happened historically, and Piotr Rawicz and Lysak Rudnitsky back in their youth were the closest friends, were the best friends. Later, Lysak Rudnitsky wrote that he taught Piotr Ukrainian. In 1937, they together enrolled in the Lviv University, the Department of Law, but a semester later, in 1938, Rawicz left university because of the events and only returned in 1940 as a student of Oriental Studies. According to documents in Yad Vashem, in 1941-45, Rawicz was at first in the Lviv ghetto, then in the Gestapo prison in Sanok, in Tarnów, and then in a concentration camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And eventually in 1944, in September 1944, he was moved to the camp of Leitmeritz, where he was until liberation in May 1945. And until September 1944, so before he was moved to Leitmeritz, he was mentioned in documents as Yuri Bosak, born in Sopotin, a civilian worker prisoner, and only later under his own name. In 1947, Piotr Rawicz and his wife, Rebecca Yavich, was later known in France as Anke Dastre. They moved to France, having been granted a stipend, a scholarship by the Sorbonne. But after he lost the scholarship in the spring of 1949, Piotr began to work for the communist Polish press agency, sending news and articles in the Polish press every day under a French pseudonym. However, Rawicz himself saw himself primarily as a writer, saw his calling as that of a writer. And in 1961, Gallimard published his first autobiographical novel on the Holocaust called Blood, Blood from the Sky. He was given the Rivarol reward for this, awarded to the best works written in French language by foreigners. Later, the Gallimard literary editorship invited him as a freelance employee, and he also started sitting on various literary juries, which also financed his trips to Germany, Israel, and other countries. In 1969, he published a second book. It was a book on the events of May 1968 in Paris, and the response to this was completely different to Blood from the Sky because the book was very critical. However, in spite of this book was broadly discussed in Eastern and Central, in the circles of Eastern and Central European immigrants, which was supported by the very friendly review of Czesław Miłosz, published in the Paris Cultura. Until the end of his life, Rawicz worked in literature. One of his biggest achievements were his efforts to translate the works of East and Central European writers in French. Often he himself wrote the forewords, and one such novels published in French through his efforts was the novel Vasyl Barka's Żółty Kniaz, Yellow Prince, as we know, is about the Holodomor. The foreword to this work, which came out in 1981, was the penultimate text written by Rawicz, because in May 1982, slightly more than a month after the birth of his ex-wife from difficult disease, he committed suicide. He took his own life. Although this Blood from the Sky is one of the first written in French, and is one of the first about the Holocaust, and because it was, nevertheless, we don't have the full academic biography of Rawicz, and in some period of his youth, we lack a lot of information. It's a lacuna that covers half of his life. We don't know how he survived really the Holocaust, and because Blood from the Sky is an eyewitness to the Holocaust with clear hints at places and written in so-called autobiographical form, it's very tempting to take the events he describes as events as they were, as he experienced them. However, our knowledge of this information are extremely scant, and the memoirs of further colleagues only make the situation worse, because very often they are mutually exclusive. In spite of the fact that there's not much time, I will not provide them. However, I would ask you to believe that they really do not agree with each other. Piotr Rawicz, in writing his debut novel, he kind of played to forestall possible historical view of his view. He says, this book is not a historical document. If accidents didn't seem to the author meaningful, I would write that they're all that any coincidences with persons living or dead are accidental. It should be noted that the author has put a lot of effort into depersonalizing any of the people. He doesn't use even a single date or name of a place. He also changes the names of the real historical characters. There are several narrative voices, none of which carry his name. However, many of these so-called secrets can be easily guessed at, because although the names are changed, the descriptions remain true to life. This is particularly noticeable on the example of towns or cities, and it's the same with the protagonist. Thus, one of the key protagonists in the city is the so-called Leon L, or sometimes also LL, is described as an old lawyer and friend of the protagonist, who was often in their home and later made head of the gmina. Now, his real prototype is Leib Landau, and there was another person named Garin who, using his material, his influential connections and his wealth, he organized workshops, Garin's workshops. He completely corresponds to the person who ran the workshops in the ghetto. So obviously that the Piotr Rawicz novel presents real events and real people, and they can be separated and identified, but it seems just as obvious that the exact description of his experience in the Holocaust was neither a priority nor even particularly important personally to him. Just the character of the descriptions points to this, and from the point of view of the historical research, we cannot take the events
Дуже така
described in the novel
підтверджувальної даних
as
інших
historical
джерел.
truth because we cannot confirm
Тим
them
не
through other
менш, я
sources.
вважаю, що
Nevertheless,
такі
I
є,
think
власне,
that
джерелом
this work is
дослідження
a source
біографії
for the
Равича,
study of the
де
biography of
розуміти, в
Ravitch,
який
but
спосіб
not in
йому
the sense
вдалося
of
пережити
how he
події
managed to
41,
survive the
43
events of
років, а в
1941-43.
площині сенсів,
However,
які
but
він
more
переживає, не
like
так
in,
особисто,
in the sense,
думаю.
in the point of senses that he
Однією з таких
articulates
речей є
less,
українськість головного героя
less
роману. За сюжетом
in a
під
less
час одного
articulate
з
fashion.
допитів
One of the
герой,
lines is
чи
that the character is
персонаж
Ukrainian. The
Юрій
protagonist
Перес,
is
за його
Ukrainian.
знайдені нові документи,
One of the
заявляє, що він
heroes
не є
presented as Yuri
поляком, як
Kolets.
повідомили, і
He
до
says
нього
that he's not a
інтерв'ю
Pole,
приводять
as
того собі
others did,
Василя
and
Гуменюка, доктора
Vasil Humaniuk
філософії,
comes to him,
члена
PhD, a
окупаційної
doctor of
поліції,
philosophy and member of the
перед
occupational
яким
police,
Юрій видає себе за
to
українського
whom Yuri
націоналіста.
says that he's a Ukrainian nationalist.
І Гуменюк задає
Presents himself
йому
as a Ukrainian
таке
nationalist, and
хитре
Humaniuk
питання,
asks
хто є
him
найвидатнішим
this
українським поетом.
difficult question, trick question, right? Who is the most famous Ukrainian poet? And he has this dialogue in his head. Well, you can say Shevchenko is too primitive, and he says it is Igor Hranich, whom he describes as a marginal modernist, almost unknown to everyone, and he explains in detail. And the description of this Igor Hranich is entirely corresponds to the figure of Bogdan Ihor Antonich. And this fact, much like the other discussion of Ukrainian modernist literature, press, political situation, nationalism, and other episodes of the novel that mentions Ukrainians and Poles and their relationships with themselves, their relationships with Jews, points to truly a very deep familiarity of the author in the topic and even his sympathies. And really, we have only very slim, extremely slim chances to find out whether this interrogation ever really happened. But I think more important to the study of the intellectual biography Pyotr Ravitch is the fact itself that he even supposed the possibility to introduce himself as a Ukrainian intellectual and knew very well what this intellectual is like. Apart from these very small but revealing passages, there isn't much we know about Ravitch's relations with Ukrainians and the Lviv intellectual elite in particular. Almost all of these information comes from one source, from Ivan Lysakov-Dnitsky. Ravitch only has one direct mention of this, and that was expressed much later in an interview to an Israeli journalist in 1970. Another very important thing that can be traced in the novel is Ravitch's immersion in the Talmudic tradition, although his origin isn't a mystery, isn't a secret, but the fact that his birth in a Jewish family wasn't a clear marker of self-identification, is particularly considering the nuances of inter-ethnic relationships in interwar Lviv and relationships between different groups of Jews. Also, obviously, for many Jews, the Holocaust was a turning point because whereas prior to the war, they could, maybe with difficulty, but identify themselves in a kind of dispersed manner, the threat to their life had to change this outlook. There's also a whole number of works that study the type of work that when the author turns to writing, and studies by certain scholars shows that this turn to writing is not a consequence, is not the effect of the particularly tragic nature of the Holocaust, but more traditional, an expression of the Jewish tradition of thinking and writing. The blood from the sky, in Blood from the Sky, we constantly find references to the Bible, in addition to the usual traditional reference to the Bible and other works, to show the history of the Jews and their suffering. There's another motif that differentiates Ravitch from this massive, from this body of work on Jewish suffering, because he presents the Holocaust not just as predictable, but actually as normal. He describes it as something that corresponds to the most profound essence of humanity. And the problem is that the suffering of the Jews could not be explained either through their being chosen or through their being particularly sinful, because many of the Jews who died didn't think of themselves as Jews or believers. Um, However, for Ravitch, the Kabbalah proposed a different concept of God, in which God was not absolute, but only something that limited himself for the sake of creating the world. And through this creation, evil became real. And because God, who participates in what happens to the world, nevertheless, he doesn't affect and cannot affect the world. So the responsibility is fully laid on the shoulders of mankind. And in Blood from the Sky, in Ravitch's work, we constantly face these episodes with Kabbalistic motifs that have to do with the creation of the world, the history, and the relationship between the maker and the creation. And in this sense, there are easily found traces. There are Shekhinah, or the letters of the Jewish alphabet, that fly away, disperse on the wind. Ravitch is happy to use the image of the Mashiach and the Golem, which he later juxtaposes or joins. The question is of when and how Ravitch encountered the Kabbalah is a separate question. It deserves a separate study, because in a late Israeli interview, he says that when he left university, he made money by being a classics tutor. And one of his students was Avram Enshurkech of the dynasty of Tzadikim of Belz, who, in response to his teaching Latin and Greek, they studied Judaism and also Zohar and the Talmud, the book of Zohar and the Talmud. Likely, possibly he developed an interest in Judaism thanks to the works of Martin Buber. This can be attested to by the fact that in 1961 he sent his novel to him with the inscription, "Without Gog and Magog, my life would have been different." And then, perhaps most importantly, in the 1930s and 40s, when the works of Gershom Scholem started being published, and the limits, the publications from the Book of Zohar that he mentions were probably from Scholem, in the translation of Scholem. In any case, even if we suppose that Ravitch never read Scholem in German, in the 1950s, when he was already living in Paris, we found French translations that were definitely available to him. And nevertheless, I think one of the most important questions that can be asked about Ravitch would be why he wrote in this way, why of all of the different options he uses the treatment of the Holocaust through Kabbalistic philosophy, why it was so resonant, why it resonated so much with him. Back when I was looking and reading in the various encyclopedias of the literature of the Holocaust, I noticed a similarity. I was really struck by the similarity in the way of writing and the biography of Ravitch and Romusudzka, and especially Paul Celan. So it turns out all three of them belongs to the same generation, obviously, formed in more or less the same conditions, born in more or less the same time, between 1913 and 1920, in the territory of the so-called Bloodlands. And even more than that, their youth was spent in three border cities, in Vilnius, Chernivtsi, and Lviv. And that was precisely when national identity started to play a key role, and relationships between different groups living in the cities became more problematic, and anti-Semitism became increasingly public and cruel. They all had Jewish roots, however, their families were not Orthodox, so there was a certain plasticity, both religiously and linguistically and culturally, in all of those senses. And all three of them received both the traditionally Jewish education and secular education, high secular education. And when in doing that, they all suffered from anti-Semitism. They lived through the Holocaust in various ways. Unfortunately, unless I'm mistaken, all three lost their mothers in the Holocaust. After the war, they wrote fictional works of what they had to live through. And these works have a common trait in that they depict the Holocaust not as a unique tragedy, but as one of a line of similar tragedies, though no less ineffable, no less unspeakable because of that. And more importantly, all three of them have these mystical motifs, and this mysticism shows different ways of looking for one's identity in the post-war time. These ways are rooted in territories, languages, and origins. And again, from down to lack of time, I'm not going to go into detail of either his biography or his writing, but if needed, I will be happy to do this in discussion. I would like to say that these references to the Jewish mystical tradition and the Kabbalistic motifs used in Celan, Sutzkever, and Ravitch are at least partly connected to the finding of a new Jewish identity for their authors, the identity that they did not have and did not want to have prior to the events of the Holocaust, but were forced to adapt, form in the wartime and post-war years. And at the same time, they never became profoundly religious in the classical sense of the word, but were rather in this kind of philosophical edge, limit, boundary that this Jewish tradition, Jewish religious, philosophical, and very deep intellectual mysticism make possible. This border state was, this liminality was more pronounced for Celan and Ravitch because they after the war they remained living in a world where this self-identification were completely alien, and they couldn't separate from it by going into the world of high art. Right, and to the language they spoke is pretty well reflective of the form and essence of their writing. For Ravitch, it was French that he had to overcome every single time, and he created a distance between, he had to struggle with, and it created a distance between him and his memories. This is very well seen in the structure of the work. Let me just share my screen very briefly. No, I can't, sorry. The thing is that he leads the three different parts from different protagonists, and the third part of the novel is in third person. The real name of the main character. So to conclude, an analysis of the work of Piotr Aravich's novel lets us see a glimpse of his personality that would not be possible to research through other sources. On the one hand, it gives us a good view of his Ukrainian background, and on the other hand, it shows us not just his familiarity with the Jewish culture, tradition, and sacred texts, but also shows Aravich's profound immersion in Jewish mysticism, through the prism of which he describes the Holocaust. And this mysticism is what he acquired trying to understand and witness to others what happened in the Holocaust, even though it doesn't stand for a profound religiosity. It's this kind of specifically philosophical liminality. That's it from me. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Professor Irina Dmitryshin of the Institute of Eastern Languages and Civilizations. Pani Irina, the floor is yours. Microphone, please.
Перепрошую, я вимкнула і забула.
Все на те.
Дякую, пане професоре, за надане слово. Складний роман, йдеться про один з великих текстів ХХ століття. Я дякую пані Кетчів за те, що вона взялася за його дослідження і взагалі за введення цього тексту в обіг в Україні, що, безумовно, поглибить наші знання про Голокост, живитиме спільне розуміння того, що сталося, психологічний вимір і сприйняття тих, хто пройшов і вижив. Маємо справу з певним анахронізмом. Я думаю, це вже згадувалося. І анахронізм полягає в тому, що до нас, до українського читача, всі ці тексти приходять в запізнілому періоді, тому що вільний в момент
the free world
їхньої
discovered
появи,
them
ці тексти
as
провокували
they
дискусію,
arose.
була певна динаміка,
There
певна
was
хронологія,
a
то
certain
українське читач
dynamic,
їх відкриває здебільшого
whereas
останніми
now
роками і
Ukrainian
з запізненням
readers
і,
only
скажімо так,
discovering them
гамузом, коли
recently
пізніші,
and
більш
altogether.
сучасні тексти
And
приходять
so
раніше, ніж більш давні і засадничі твори.
So
Вже
this
згадалося,
understanding of these
що
texts comes later than
Роман Равіча вийшов у
older
61-му році.
older texts. Now, of
Перший
course, it should be
французький
mentioned that the
текст
Ravitch
про Голокост
text
вважається успіх, переклад
published
на 13
in
мов. Моє перше
1961.
питання
It's been
до
translated
пані
in
Уляни буде, з яким текстом
13
ви
languages.
працювали?
And so
Чи
my first
працювали
question
з
to Uliana is,
французьким
what text
текстом,
were you
чи
working
з
with? Were you
одним
working
з
with the French
перекладів,
text or one of the
і чи
translations? And
можна буде вам завдячувати колись перекладу цього роману на
might we hope that you
українську
one day
мову?
will
Я в
translate it
такому
into
разі
Ukrainian?
абсолютно вас всіляко до цього
I would
заохочую,
love to
тому що текст
encourage you to do it because
герметичний,
the text is
і так,
hermetic.
як ви його
And
розкодовуєте, так,
as
як ви його
your
розумієте,
decoding of it, your
я
understanding
думаю,
of
що
it,
ніхто
I
його
think
так не
no one
зрозуміє,
else
як ви,
can
яка
provide that level of
його
understanding,
дослідили, які
which has studied, who has studied it and
заохочували і різні
encouraged
виміри,
different
і
dimensions,
політичні, і
political
кабалістичні, і
and
теологічні, і так далі. Отже, треба буде його
theological and
розкодувати
kabbalistical.
і
I mean, it
відповідно в
requires
українській
decoding,
мові
and so in the Ukrainian
закодувати
language, and
для
it requires
українського читача. Тобто,
encoding.
я всіляко заохочу взятися за цю роботу, коли ваша дисертація
I
буде
encourage you to
закінчена,
take on
поза
this
як
work
сам
after your
роман
dissertation is done,
заслуговує,
because
очевидно, на
the novel
публікацію
itself obviously deserves
завдяки, через
publication,
постать Равіча, але
thanks to
також
the
і,
figure of Ravitch,
ви
but
про це
also,
згадали,
and you mentioned
тим,
this,
що ми йому
because
завдячуємо появі
we
у Франції
owe him
тексту Василя Барки, «Жовтого князя».
the fact that
Це абсолютно
Vasil
була
Barka's Yellow Prince came out in
заслуга
France. That was
Барки,
his achievement.
заслуга
That was
Равича у
Ravitch's
тому, що цей
achievement.
текст з'явився, і
And
у цьому тексті, у цій публікації у Галімарі в
but in
1951
the
році
text of this publication,
є
Gallimard in
дуже
1961, there's a
велике
very
місце займає сама передмова Равича, яка
Ravitch's
займає
forward takes a lot of
20
space. It
сторінок
takes
тексту,
about
і
20
де
pages
Равич,
of text. And
ну, зрештою, це
Ravitch,
такий пасіонарний текст
it's this
в
very
ім'я, во
impassioned text,
славу України, де він згадує
glorifying
історію України,
Ukraine, mentioning
і
Ukraine, talking about
політичну, і
Ukraine,
літературну, очевидно, згадує
political,
Голодомор,
literary.
але також
Obviously, he
і
mentions the
Голокост,
Holodomor and the
говорить про
Holocaust,
колаборацію
and he talks
українську,
about the
але також
Ukrainian
говорить і
collaboration, but
про
he also
роль
talks
митрополита
about the
Шептицького
role
у
of
врятуванні
Metropolitan Sheptytsky in
євреїв,
the
згадує
sheltering of
літературу
Jews and
як
saving of Jews. He
класичну,
mentions
тобто Шевченка, Франка, Лесю Українку, але і наше
both
російське
classical literature, but also our
від
executed Renaissance,
там
from
Плужника,
Pluzhnik to
Йогансена
Johansen
до
and
Хвильового,
Хвильовий.
згадує
He
родину Рудницьких, і, зокрема,
mentions the
незабутнє
Rudnitskis, and
Мілену
he
Рудницьку. Тобто
writes
цей
about
текст є також надзвичайно
unforgettably about
важливим
Milena
для
Rudnitska. So this is a very
представлення
important text
України
in terms of
як
presenting
у
Ukraine.
Франції,
That
поважна на той час
that is
людина,
done by a
відомий
well-respected,
письменник.
well-renowned writer
Я
in
єдине
France
хочу
at the time.
зачитати
And
останню
I only
фразу
wanted to write the last read the last phrase of this
передмови, де
of his
він,
forward, where he says,
ви, напевно, пам'ятаєте, де він пише, що
where
майбутнє
he writes
України
that the future
матиме
of Ukraine
на долю цілого людства вирішальне
will have decisive influence on the fate of
l'avenir
humanity.
de l'Ukraine aura sur celui de l'humanité entière une influence décisive. Це направду справжній крик любові до
This is truly a cry of love
я думаю,
for
що цей
Ukraine.
текст,
And I think that this
якщо
text,
не менше служить вам у розумінні його біографії, все-таки додає
if it serves in your understanding his biography,
до
still
того,
adds
наскільки
color
він був
to
дотичний, втягнутий в
how he was
український
affected, how he was
контекст, як під
involved
час
in the
його
Ukrainian
перебування у
context,
Львові,
both
так
in
і
his life in Lviv and
пізніший
in his
період.
later period.
Ви вже згадали, що у своїй післямові
You already
автор
mentioned
пише, що ця книжка не є історичним документом.
in your
Очевидно, це слова
forward that
автора,
this
які повинні ми
book is not
сприйняти
a historical document. Obviously, it's the author's work, and should we take it personally? Should we take it literally? But obviously,
питання,
Ravitch
яке він згадував в одному з інтерв'ю,
poses the question that he mentioned in one of the interviews when he said how to write his truth about the intolerable. How do we
зробити, і він переводить свідчення у абсолютно
And he
новий вимір, тобто
puts
свідок
this
у непрямий
as a witness. He gives this
важливо знати, що йдеться про людину, яка особисто пережила Голокост. Отже, це питання свідка, його ролі, який спосіб це робити. І, можливо, моє останнє питання стосується його ремарки у передмові до книжки Барти, коли Равіч пише, що в момент великого злочину реальність стає чорно-білою. Ми вчора і сьогодні говорили про багатоголосся, про різні тони, про темний, білий, але також сірі зони. Отже, на вашу думку, чи все-таки йдеться про такий чіткий розподіл маніхейський, чорно-білий, чи все-таки Равіч, попри те, що він
monochrome separation, or is it in spite of what Ravich writes, he still shows different nuances and different shades of the situation? Thank you.
Я постараюся.
I'll try to be brief. Now, as for the text I was working with, it so happened that I first read the translation because it was available, and then I got to the original. Which translation? First the English translation, then Polish, then the original, then I read the Polish. The Polish translation is considered maybe even better than the original. Must have been the structure of his language. And the only thing that bothers me in the original is the constant wordplay, which is very difficult for me because my French is, I mean, I read, but I don't, it's not that good to take this on. So I don't know. I understand that this is wordplay, but in order to understand what he's doing will take me a long time digging and looking. As for Milena Rudnicka, I love that, you know, Ravich wrote his first novel with this very touching dedication. He wrote that this is my sad child, my very unserious alibi. This is more about their relationship. As for him as witness, well, my answer so far that I found for myself is that this is a work of fiction. This is literature, it's obvious. And I don't want to see the events described as reality, precisely because the testimony of his friends often disagree. First of all, they're mutually exclusive, completely mutually exclusive. So they're completely different theories and suggestions, suppositions about how he survived the Holocaust. But very often I find things that repeat the events of the novel. And I'm not sure that this isn't a consequence of reading. I think that maybe, you know, as the years go by, because these are mostly posthumous mentions, I think it all came together. It came into this one big mess. And so I think we should look into that novel, things that are not obvious in other sources, and we should be less concerned with trying to decode real places and because this could have been real places that someone else saw, or real events that could have been witnessed by someone else. So, and David simply described them. And as for the forward to the Żółty Kniaz, the Yellow Prince, when reality becomes black and white, well, the forward was written 20 years after the book came out. There was a massive change in Ravich and his vision of the world and his attitude to different historical events, because when in the novel you can easily trace how darkly he describes people as incapable of anything good, and because the world is just like that, always been like that, and will always be like that, and there's nothing to be done about it, that's just the way it is. Then in 1969 his second book comes out, which is very critical of the events of the May of 1968, and he mentions that they don't want to see the crimes of the Soviet Union, and he stresses the same thing in every review that he writes for most of his reviews that he writes. He constantly writes that these people do not want to see and hear about the crimes of the Soviet Union. So you have this change, and I think by the time he wrote the forward to Barca, many things changed. I think perhaps at the time it seemed to him less that the world is not as black as he previously thought. And finally, there was a question by Konstantin Sikhov. Yeah, the question was, are they published in France and in the West? And yes, there are several. I think there are 2 English translations. They keep being published. I don't want to tell you the wrong information because I haven't checked. In Poland, there's been a translation in 2004, I think. It's a very good translation with commentary, not commentary to the text, but there's some bits of interview, and often it's constantly mentioned in bigger works on literature of the Holocaust. It's always mentioned, almost always, as one of the important works. That's it. Пані Ірина, do you have anything to add? No, I just would like to wish Uляна приїхати because as part of this 2-year project she wanted to
проконсультувати архіви Равіча, які лишилися
the Ravitch archives that survived.
Одній зустрідниці, я не пригадую зараз її прізвище, отже, я сподіваюся, що ви зможете приїхати і таким чином поглибити і розширити спектр ваших знань про це.
I'm happy to say that Uляna has the stipend and she's leaving in the following days. We found her an apartment. So we're hopeful that you will soon see each other and can talk about it. I'll be very happy. So yeah, there's it's not for nothing to be covered. Formally, we are concluding the seminar, but we have time for a free conversation. So I would like to maybe talk about the seminar in context of what we're going to do afterwards. Because I understand that, because I remind you that this is a seminar as part of our joint French-Ukrainian project that has half started, half not, because we still don't have the confirmation of the financing from the Ukrainian funding. But nevertheless, we decided to start it, and we intend to work for 2 years. I don't think there's anyone better to start this discussion is to give the floor again to Ірина Дмитришин.
Дуже дякую, пане професоре.
Thank you.
Перш за все, це дійсно наша перша подія в рамках цієї дворічної програми, яка, нагадую, називається «Тягар пам'яті про Голокост в Україні», перехресні дослідження Франції та України. Мета проекту полягала у вивченні проблем історії Голокосту в Україні та пам'яті про нього у транснаціональній та порівняльній перспективах. У рамках цих 2 років були передбачені численні воркшопи для молодих дослідників, семінари, конференції, поїздки в обидва боки. На жаль, ковід поламав наші плани, але я сподіваюся, що це тільки все зсунулося, і завдяки цій першій конференції, потім я сподіваюся, що буде публікація, як вже було згадано в Україні, модерні. Я сподіваюся, що ми таки матимемо нагоду виконати більшість пунктів, і, зокрема, поїздки докторантів до Франції, більшість з яких, власне, і брали участь у нинішній конференції. Дуже символічно, що наша зустріч відбулася саме в ці дні, у цей знаковий день, у річницю Бабиного Яру. Конференція показала різноманіття тем і широку географію досліджень, певний сув до мікродосліджень, що подібно до, що дозволить таких пікселів, які поступають поступово і дозволяють виокремити до щонайменших деталей загальну картину Голокосту в Україні. Присутність молодих дослідників поряд з більш досвідченими, зокрема західними, що дає надію на прогресивне надолужування у вивченні історії Голокосту і заповненні порожнеч.
this gives us hope about filling the gaps in the study of the Holocaust. I would like to thank the organizers, the people who studied and discussants, who shared their critical views and remarks that particularly enabled the discussion on the terminology or a more precise or accurate use of terminology or the use of more nuanced definitions. Also, obviously, I'd like to thank all the moderators and organizers of this work, and I hope that this work will become one of the contributions, another contribution to the commemoration of the victims, which is, of course, perhaps the main goal of Holocaust research, including of our 2-year project. We have many technical questions about the program. I don't know if it's worth putting this in the general stream, or perhaps we should do some kind of summary and then do a narrower discussion. I think we should do that separately, yeah. Thank you, Irina. I see Professor Wolf-Moscovich from Israel, but before that, I would like to Professor Konstantin, because I know he has to leave. Can I ask you to speak? Yes, I wanted to thank actually just this final presentation by about Piotr Rawicz shows how important it is, this cross study, cross research between France and Ukraine. Ukraine is awaiting translation of key texts by Piotr Rawicz, and it's a very telling case that tells us about the fruitfulness and the many prospects of our French-Ukrainian studies and cooperation. I think it makes sense for us to think about a number of publications in future, both on the internet, on paper, of materials that really will argue for the benefits of our cooperation. Okay, so if we want a competition, we have a fantastic chance of a 2-year program, but it's very important for us to think in the long term, such that the cooperation of all our institutions in Ukraine and in the West allowed us to switch from this limit of this very kind of haphazard gasping for air, and then start a longer stretch. We have the chance for this in spite of the whole pandemic situation. First of all, we have the quality also. We've seen at our colloquium, we've seen the quality of the synthesis, this unique synthesis that is arising in front of our eyes between different generations from different countries, and different from scholars of different generations of different countries. So on the one hand, there's a profound, a very sincere gratitude to everyone who contributed to this event, and at the same time, there's a sense that this ought to inspire us for a deeper cooperation. I'm sure that both the Mohila Academy and Duch and Litera and the Center for Judaica and the Center for European Studies is simply strategic for us. A cooperation is simply strategic for us. And so it seems to me that it's important for us to simply think in terms of what the next steps might be for unification, for cooperation between our institutions and our personal efforts to continue this conversation. Thank you. Thank you, particularly for participating so avidly in this seminar. I'm one of the co-organizers. It's very important for us that we work together, these institutions. Our character is such that we have to work together. It's that example. It's the example of the duty being also a pleasant duty. I think, as Professor Sigov said, this is a long-term situation. We want to institutionalize this. I would just say a few remarks so as not to abuse the floor. I'll repeat the thesis. I think that one of the greatest achievements of Ukraine's independence is the young generation. What we're hearing this today, if I closed my eyes and didn't know what language they were speaking, these could very easily have been people who are fully integrated in Holocaust studies, and it's a very sophisticated level. This isn't, beginner's level. It's almost a miracle. Where did they come from? Because there was no institutional support. There were no special grants. and this gives me hope, but also gives us the duty. What happens if we try to institutionalize this? Basically, it's a question of trying to help grow the first formation of young Ukrainian scholars who are professionally working in this topic, and help them. Something I noticed today from the start of the first session was that the young scholars touch gray subjects, and immediately we have the questions: why is this? Is this accidental, or is it because we have enough studies that function in this black and white world, this monochrome world that Uliana mentioned? Do we have enough? So do we have enough studies of the Holocaust in the last 30 years that allow us to close this lacuna, this forced lacuna in the study of the Holocaust, because Ukraine was not part of this research? So do we have have we reached a new condition, a new status from which to move? I think it's a very important statement if it is so. My second desire for us would be that research of Holocaust in Ukraine went through the same change that happened in other countries. When I hope that the research of the Holocaust doesn't ghettoize, where the scholars of the Holocaust don't know what was happening in the territories where the Holocaust was happening, what other things were happening at the same time. And I think that the advantage that we have, and the thing that I like is that this is, as societies of extreme violence, that I really like this term by Gerlach, and that we have this in Ukraine where all this is happening. And I would like to see that these studies that we have, Holocaust studies that we have in Ukraine, put a start to the study of violence in general. Obviously, I hope that the development of Holocaust studies will provoke the development of other fields. I'm happy that the Ukrainian Austrian Commission and the Ukrainian German Commission have joined us. The German grant have so far been given a grant for the development of the Center of the Research of Violence. Kai Struve is going to head this project, and this gives me hope that we can move further. So I hope that we see today's conference as a first step to something, but a first step to something very systematic, and a long-term project, a long-term strategic project. I would like now to give to invite everybody to participate in the discussion, particularly with regard to what we can do next. I've already said that I see among us Professor Wolf Moskowicz because he's an outsider, and if he's with us, I would like to give him the floor. Professor, are you with us? Would you like to say anything? Okay, then perhaps I open the discussion. If there are no volunteers, I will invite people. Okay. Perhaps I will ask Dieter Pohl to say, express his opinion on this conference and what we could do, how we could continue this project.
Yeah, first thing is I was quite impressed about the state of Holocaust research in Ukraine or by Ukrainians abroad. And that's quite different from what I experienced during the 1990s, when this state was rather unclear and there was few, I would say, empirically based research. What I think is necessary to rely on the already existing structures. I mean, it's probably not the time to think of a Ukrainian center of Holocaust studies comparable to the ones in Washington or in Jerusalem. I'm very critical about the projects in Kiev, both of them, actually. I already mentioned that. And I don't think they will give the basis for that. So the most important thing is to have a network. Content-wise, I just repeat what I said before. It's very important to go from the top to the bottom, to have these micro studies, but also never to forget the whole story in two senses. It's a European-wide process. So we need integration of different kind, we need comparison, and we need, I would say, examples also. For example, if you're working about this Ukrainian auxiliary police, this is a very important research, very innovative research, but the next step must be what's happening in Polish or exile Polish historiography right now with Jan Grabowski. His book, which I think is very polemical in a certain sense, but even more important and less known, is Tomasz Friedl's studies, because he, unlike Grabowski, gives a whole societal set how Polish policemen and Polish individuals acted in 43, 44, and so forth. And now there's a variety of factors, and it's not only anti-Semitism, which is Grabowski's thesis. So it's necessary to look at what do researchers do in other countries, on other structures, and so on and so forth, and to take these conceptual examples and to try to apply them, for example, on Ukraine. The same applies, for example, to studies who try to integrate all aspects of the Holocaust, like the German occupation, the Jewish community, the Jewish perspective, and of course the overall society. If you look at Christoph Diekmann's book on Lithuania, which is unfortunately not translated in any other language, but this is the most important study on the Holocaust. I mean, he knows all the languages, including Hebrew and Yiddish, and you have all the perspectives, and this changes the picture a lot. Unfortunately, it's a 1,500-page book. It recently came out in second edition. But this is an example how to do it, and also to integrate it into the longer chronology. And my plea is finally to integrate all aspects of German violence or German-induced violence during the occupation. That is not to forget the Soviet POWs, not to forget the Roma. The research on the mentally ill or the crimes against mentally ill is on the way. But what, for example, one group which is not very in focus are the victims of German anti-partisan warfare. Koryukivka, for example, is completely unknown in the West. This is also important for conceptual comparison, why the Jews, why others not. For example, if you look at sexual violence, there are different contexts for that. So I think it's necessary to widen the perspective, look what's going on all over the world in Holocaust research, and try to connect to especially European-wide structures. That's what I think is probably an approach for the future.
Дуже дякую. Я не знаю, чи існує вже Українська асоціація дослідників Holocaust.
Thank you. I don't know if there is a Ukrainian association of Holocaust studies, but if there isn't, I think it would be a good place to start and to include it into a general network.
Пане Костю, виключіть свій мікрофон, якщо ваша ласка. Я зараз попрошу до слова професора.
I would now like to give the floor to Karl Berkhoff. Karl, can I ask you to speak?
A lot, and I think it should be repeated. I agree with Dieter that the level is very high. I'm not sure if you need an association. There has been talk also about an association for a European Association for Holocaust Studies, but it seems a little that the days where such associations are useful are gone. They are mostly useful when they have a long existence and lots of funding to fund people to come to conferences. But we have the ERI project, which will become a permanent entity. European Holocaust research infrastructure, which offers fellowships. So I encourage those of you who are perhaps not aware that those who are in the field, whether young or old, can apply and travel to an archive of interest, and the list is very long. And we also have other events. That's basically it. My hope is that this kind of format, which spans 2 Ukrainian cities, might be repeated. It's not very expensive, I hope, and it could easily remain online. I think a lot of people do not have the desire or time to travel for just a few days anymore. So please keep that in mind, that perhaps you should do this every year, or, you know, once every 2 years. It doesn't really that matter. This is a Ukrainian language format that's rather rare. We have other formats online that are in English. The Holocaust Educational Foundation in North America is rather active. But this is a very special event that, once again, maybe you should try to repeat it sometime. But anyway, thank you very much. Дуже дякую.
Thank you so much, dear Carol. Could you please share information, the link for the fund you just referred to? Thank you. І я хочу сказати, що наша німецько-українська комісія...
And I would like to say that our German-Ukrainian Commission is planning a conference in October in Odessa on the Holocaust. This will have to do with the memorial to the massacre in Odessa. So you're invited, and we will be talking about this. And my impression of today's event, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that there's no point in separating young scholars and old scholars, because the level of the young scholars is quite mature. So I don't think we need another ghetto. Unfortunately, I have to leave in 10 minutes because I have a class. If we finish by then I will ask Petro to take on. But if Kai is with us, perhaps I'd like to ask him to say a few words. I don't see Kai. Sorry, I'm a small screen. Okay, maybe in that case, maybe I'll ask our Ukrainian participants. Pan Andriy, what do you think of this conference? Andriy Usich, yes.
Ми вже вас чуємо.
Ні, ну мені насправді цікаво, я багатьох знав. Насправді нас так мало в Україні.
No, I mean, there's so few of us in Ukraine that it's not possible to it's hard to not know everybody, but I did know everybody, and it was very interesting to listen to the current state of research, and some of it, you know, it has to do with what I'm doing, because this is very important, because, you know, we can learn from each other, and it seems that in Ukraine there is sense in making this research and presenting it, because we keep finding new sources. I don't know if you can find any new sources in Germany on the Holocaust. In Ukraine, you might even still create such sources if you go and record the last eyewitnesses. So we could make new events, and we could make them narrower. So we could talk about the sources to the history of the Holocaust, the oral history of the Holocaust, because each of these aspects is so wide that we could easily have as many presentations as we had today. And it was very important to hear for those who perhaps hadn't worked with particular archives. I don't know about the associations and such. I'm not a great fan of this kind of institutionalization, because I don't know. As we can see, most of us who have spoken here, they've always worked individually. I mean, apart from maybe some institutions who supported them or gave them platform. Maybe it makes sense. I can't be certain. We should try before we say something. I'm very grateful to everybody for their participation, and there will be recordings. You will be able to listen to it again if you hadn't heard it before. Thank you, Andrea. I didn't mean a specific association. I mean, we need a network. We have to start a more general network, maybe of the kind that Professor Barkov mentions. The form of this doesn't really it's like when your presentation, maybe it's not a question of just having conferences, maybe we should have some kind of workshop, more work variants. This could be done even in some kind of field trips. This year we had the first experience of this kind of documentalistic on the Holocaust. We did a documentary, a short documentary in Turka in Lviv on the Holocaust. And when we came up, they said, "Oh, everybody died. You won't find everybody." And eventually, we made a film. We recorded 10 people who remembered those events. And for me, it was a great experience of this kind of field work. And I think that for many, it was very interesting, both in terms of I think there are a lot of places that are interesting for the research. So this is a more of a multi-methodical, right? Igor Szczepak just had this experience in Odessa. He also came and tried to, when he showed up and they said, "Oh, no one's there, no, they're all dead." Pani Tatiana, can I ask you to say something?
Так, мене чути?
Yes, can you hear me?
Зараз. Я відключила звук, тому що мені чути Павла, і так, я трошки не на тому каналі, але спробую сказати. Я дуже вдячна всім, найперше, дискутантам, які погодилися, присвятили свій час, були з нами поруч і читали наші роботи, і аналізували, і ми отримали величезний класний фідбек і обговорення. Це надзвичайно приємно для нас, як для молодих дослідників. Для мене, сьогодні я не можу сказати, що я прям вперше виступила, але з таким своїм певним шматком роботи, таки вперше, і це дуже мотивує і надихає, тому що я отримала певний фідбек, отримала і коментарі, і так далі, і є сили рухатися далі. Для мене не так принципово, в якій формі це буде. Мені важливо не втратити оцей зв'язок, цей нетворкінг, про який ми говорили. І я би була за якісь наші періодичні зустрічі, наскільки це може бути в якійсь прийнятній для всіх формі, і готова допомагати там цій організації і так далі. Ми вже от пройшли якісь перші кроки такі, і ми маємо в цьому досвід, так що буду тільки рада долучитися, і це дуже класна ініціатива, і також дякую всім моїм колегам, молодим дослідникам, які також долучилися. Дякую.
The young scholars who joined us today. Thank you. And I would like to give the floor to Pan Petro, but also would like to ask him to take the chair from me because I have to go now. I would like to thank you all. This was a very interesting conversation. I wish you every success. I hope that we will. Thank you. Thank you, Yaroslav. To continue our conversation, is there anybody else who would like to speak? Mikhailo Martynenko just came on. Oh, with very positive impressions, great conference. Thank you for the colleagues, particularly the discussants, for their comments. I think we should continue, perhaps really repeat this next year. Maybe if the situation of the pandemic improves, maybe even live. Thank you. Marta Havrishko, are you with us? Yes, dear colleagues, I also would like to thank, first of all, the organizers and the organizers of this conference for this very important work they've done, for getting us all together. And the important thing for me is in recent years, since I've started, I speak at international forums mostly, and I really lack support in Ukraine. As somebody who studies the Holocaust, I lack institutional support and I lack this networking in Ukraine. So it seems to me that events like this show that Holocaust studies exist at a high level in Ukraine, and we can support each other should we need to in various ways, help each other grow and support each other in various situations that arise in the study of these events, and to overcome the challenges that we face as scholars of the Holocaust. One of which, of course, is the difficulty of the topic that we discuss, and sometimes that can sometimes cause rejection, objections in various circles. So I'm very grateful that events like this happen in Ukraine at this high level, and I would also really like to thank our friends from abroad, our experienced historians, our discussants, who help us grow and ultimately support Holocaust studies in Ukraine. Thank you very much for this event. Thank you, Marta. And who else hasn't spoken yet? Pani Daria is there. Are you with us? I think Pani Daria Cherkaska. Are you with us? Yes, I also wanted to sincerely thank you for this event. I think that it's very important in pandemic times that we're not that we're not closed, especially within the framework of these very sensitive studies, the Holocaust studies. I'm very grateful to the discussants and the moderators for these very important comments, for advice and the questions that were raised, as well as the opportunity to share my experience, my vision, and my research. Thank you. And finally, Uliana, I think. I don't really know what to add, apart from the fact that also wanted to thank for the opportunity and the fact that I could listen to all of your presentations and comments and questions. This has been very interesting and very important for me, and because I'm more of a literary scholar of literature, it's very important for me to not drop out of the context of other fields. I'm very grateful that I've had this opportunity to see this and experience this, so thank you very much. Thank you, Uliana. And Daniil. Thank you. I don't really know what to add, because I agree that events like this ought to be held and regularly held. And of course, it's great to hear what is being studied in Ukraine right now, and what reactions to this research by foreign and international scholars, experienced international scholars. And I would like to add to what Professor Dita Paul said. You know, we all, you know, more or less, we're all comparative studies, you know, but we understand the context. But it's very difficult to put that context in 15 minutes. So, you know, starting from the work by Grabowski and Martin Dean from the 90s to Jan Grabowski. I mean, 15 minutes, that's you know, it's a question of a bigger forum. So in any case, I thank you all for comments and discussions and interesting studies. Thank you. I would like to thank everybody from the organizers, because I was working on the technical aspects of our seminar colloquium today. I would like to note that the networking really did work, because there were challenges and questions. Some resources were missing. We quickly and collectively found out, and other partners would show up in the process, co-organizers of this event. And it's really a pleasure. It was really a pleasant surprise how easy it was to work with these people, how quickly help arrived and problems were resolved when we were missing something in the course of organizing. I would like to thank everybody for your cooperation, for your work, for your support, help. I would like to especially stress for the organizational support from Tetiana Borodina and Andriy Usach, who provided the technical organization of this event, who gave us that support. And I would also like to wish us further that we continue our cooperation. We are eagerly awaiting for the new issue of Ukraina Moderna, which was announced yesterday. We're continuing the work with most of the presenters today. We await your articles, your papers, and their publications, and the publication in the periodical. You're also invited. Our speakers are also invited to work with us, Karel Berkhoff, Kai Stroh, Edita Paul, to join us in our projects. You're invited to the participation in our forum of this new special issue of Ukraina Moderna. Thank you all for your work. Are there any more additions? In that case, we're going to conclude our forum for today. Again, many thanks to everyone for your help, for wonderful presentations, for comments, and we will stay in touch.
Bye.
Дякую.
До побачення.